The morning she walked into that cafe, tired eyes hidden behind a practiced smile, 3 8-year-old boys orbiting her like small, chaotic planets, nobody saw a woman. They saw a headline, a cautionary tale whispered between sips of coffee, a statistic wrapped in a floral dress and scuffed flats, juggling a diaper bag she no longer needed but hadn't gotten around to replacing, because replacing it meant finding the time, and time was the one luxury the universe had decided she simply did not deserve. They looked at her the way people look at a cracked vase, acknowledging there was once something beautiful there, but certain, absolutely certain that no one would ever choose to fill it with flowers again. She could feel their eyes. She had learned, over 8 long years of doing everything alone, to feel eyes the way a sailor feels weather, in the bones, before the storm arrives. What none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly anticipated, sitting in that warm cafe nursing their lattes and their quiet judgments, was that those 3 small boys orbiting her were not her burden, they were her army. And today, completely without warning, they were about to go to war. Her name was Claire Beaumont, and she had not always been tired. There was a version of her that existed in photographs, a laughing woman with bright eyes and the kind of effortless posture that belongs to people who have not yet learned what it feels like to carry the world in their arms. That woman wore heels to casual dinners. That woman read books for pleasure, finishing them without falling asleep on page 42. That woman made plans, real plans, the kind that stretched years into the future, with a man named Daniel, who had kind hands and a smile that made rooms feel warmer. Daniel left when the boys were 14 months old. He did not leave dramatically. There was no screaming, no door slamming, no cinematic moment of destruction that Claire could point to later as the precise second her life divided into before and after. He simply became less present, incrementally, the way winter arrives, slowly and then all at once. First the late nights, then the weekends away for work, then the phone calls that went unanswered. Then one Tuesday morning, while Eli was crying and Mason was pulling himself up on the coffee table and Noah was staring at the ceiling making the soft, wondering sounds he always made, Daniel sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, "I'm not built for this, Claire," as though it were an apology rather than an abandonment. She did not cry until he was gone, and when she started, she wasn't sure she would ever stop. But she did stop because Eli needed his diaper changed, and Mason had gotten his fingers stuck in the coffee table hinge, and Noah had gone ominously quiet in the way that always meant he was doing something that required immediate parental intervention. And so Claire Beaumont wiped her face with the back of her hand, stood up from the kitchen floor where she had collapsed, and became a single mother. That was the last time she cried for Daniel. Everything that came after, the tears, and there were many, were cried for herself, quietly, after the boys were in bed. Tears of exhaustion so profound it felt physical, like being hollowed out with a spoon. Tears of loneliness that hit hardest on Sunday mornings, which had once been her favorite time of the week and were now just another operational challenge to manage before Monday. Tears of anger sometimes, hot and justified when another bill arrived, or when the car made the noise again, or when she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman looking back. But never in front of the boys, never once. She had decided that early, in those first blurry weeks of solo parenthood, when the boys were too young to understand anything but could already sense everything. She would not let them see her break. She would show them only what she wanted them to become, steady and warm and unafraid. What she had not anticipated was that in doing so, she would accidentally raise 3 of the most emotionally perceptive human beings she had ever encountered. Triplets, people like to say, as though the word itself explained something, as though the judgments came in different shapes. There was the overt kind, the woman at the grocery store who looked at the 3 boys and then at Claire's left hand and then back at Claire with an expression of such transparent pity that Claire had to look away and pretend to be extremely interested in the soup selection. There were the school gates, where social hierarchies were as rigid and merciless as any adult workplace, where the coupled mothers had their own gravitational pull that Claire orbited but never quite entered. There were the well-meaning relatives who used phrases like, "I don't know how you do it," with an inflection that made it sound less like admiration and more like bewilderment, as though Claire were somehow surprising them by continuing to exist and function. But the subtler kind was worse. The subtle kind lived in the hesitations, in the way people edited themselves mid-sentence when they realized they were about to say something that assumed a partner, in the way certain conversations were clearly not extended to her, in the entirely innocent but quietly exclusive social architecture of a world built for twos. And then there was the particular flavor of judgment that came from certain men. Not all men. Claire was not naive enough or bitter enough to flatten an entire gender into a single attitude. She had her brother Marcus, who drove 4 hours every Christmas and spent the whole visit being mercilessly defeated at board games by 3 8-year-olds who showed him no mercy and loved him completely. She had her friend's husband, James, who had fixed her stuck minivan door 3 times without ever making her feel indebted. She knew goodness existed and wore different faces. But there was also, reliably, the other kind, the kind that looked at her situation as a verdict, that treated single mother of 3 as a category rather than a person, a category that implied complication, baggage, the specific variety of emotional labor that required more than it rewarded. She had overheard this opinion stated plainly once, at a friend's birthday gathering 2 years ago, from a man named Greg who did not know she was in the next room. "She's beautiful, but come on, 3 kids, no father in the picture? That's a lot to walk into. No offense, but most guys aren't built for that." No offense, as though the caveat made it surgery rather than a knife. She had walked home that night and told herself it didn't matter. And it didn't, not in any practical sense, but it mattered the way all quiet wounds matter. Not enough to stop you, but enough to leave a mark. The Saturday of the charity brunch at Magnolia Cafe arrived the way all Saturdays arrived at the Beaumont household, in a burst of noise and negotiation that began before 7 in the morning. The brunch was for a local children's literacy organization that Claire had volunteered with for 3 years, designing their annual fundraising materials pro bono. It was a lovely event, the kind with fresh flowers on the tables and a string quartet in the corner, and an air of cultivated generosity that made everyone feel like their better selves. Claire had dressed carefully, the green wrap dress she saved for occasions, her hair actually properly done for once, the small gold earrings her mother had given her. She had spent 40 minutes getting herself ready and approximately 90 minutes getting 3 8-year-old boys into clothing that could be reasonably described as presentable. Noah had insisted on a bow tie. Eli had refused his on principle. The brunch progressed through its elegant stages. The welcome remarks, the overview of the literacy program's yearly achievements, the silent auction of donated items arranged near the entrance. Claire had composed herself thoroughly by the time she was drawn into a conversation about next year's logo designs. She did not see what happened at the coffee station. She did not see Eli watch Richard Calloway with an expression of narrowing, precise focus for approximately 4 minutes, long enough to observe, assess, and arrive at a conclusion. She did not see Eli lean toward Mason and speak quietly, rapidly, and with the specific authority he reserved for moments of genuine importance. She did not see Mason's face transform from pleasant distraction to absolute attention, which was remarkable because Mason's absolute attention was a rare and somewhat magnificent thing, like a weather event. She did not see Noah, who had been watching her the whole time, watching the coffee station, watching his brothers, quietly picking up the program booklet from the table and reading something in it with the focused expression of a person formulating a plan. What she heard, eventually, was Mason. This was not surprising. In any sequence of events involving all 3 boys simultaneously, Mason was almost always what you heard. "Excuse me." his voice carrying across the cafe with the particular acoustic confidence of a child who had never once worried about being too loud. "Excuse me, sir, could I ask you something?" A ripple of attention moved through the room, heads turning, conversations pausing. Claire heard it from across the cafe and felt the specific spinal awareness of a mother whose child has just done something she cannot yet classify. She turned. Mason was standing in front of Richard Calloway, all 4 feet and some inches of him, backwards bow tie impeccably in place, chocolate croissant residue faintly visible at the corner of his mouth, looking up at a man who had several decades and a considerable amount of life experience on him, with the serene courage of someone who had absolutely not thought through the consequences of this moment, and did not particularly care. Richard looked down at him with an expression of bemused condescension. "Can I help you, son?" "I'm not your son," Mason said pleasantly. "My dad's not really around, but that's okay because our mom is like 2 dads in one person. She's just more organized than 2 people could be." The cafe had gone considerably quieter. Claire had gone completely still. Eli appeared at Mason's left shoulder with the quiet inevitability of a closing argument. He had the program booklet in his hand. Noah had passed it to him, she would learn later, and he held it with the careful formality of someone who has decided to make a presentation. "Hi," Eli said, looking up at Richard and the assembled men with dark, steady eyes. "I'm Eli. I'm 8. I have some things I'd like to say, if that's all right. It won't take long. I'm good at being concise." Richard blinked. The man in the slightly too expensive blazer looked sideways at his companion with an expression that was beginning to shade into something more complex than amusement. "The thing is," Eli began, in the tone he used when correcting factual inaccuracies, "I heard what you said about our mom. I have very good hearing. It's actually something our pediatrician mentioned as developmentally notable." The cafe was now entirely, attentively quiet. Even the string quartet had paused between pieces, and in the silence, Eli's clear, serious voice reached every corner of the room. "You said that no man would sign up for taking on 3 kids," Eli continued. "I wanted to tell you some things about our mom, because I don't think you have accurate information, and I find it difficult to let inaccurate information stand without correction." He opened the program booklet, not because he needed it, but because it was a rhetorical device he had apparently decided to employ. "Our mom designed this." He held up the booklet. "She designed the logo, the layout, the color system, and the fundraising materials for this event, and she did it for free, because she believes in kids having access to books. She did it while working a full-time job, making our lunches, helping us with science projects about volcanoes, Mason's, not mine. Mine was about orbital mechanics, driving us to swim practice 3 times a week, and reading to us every single night without skipping a night, not even when she was sick." He paused. He looked at Richard Calloway with the particular calm of someone who is not angry, but is instead operating from such a secure foundation of certainty that anger is unnecessary. "She has never once let us see her cry," Eli. The brunch reassembled itself, the way events do after moments of unexpected emotional intensity, slightly dazed, slightly altered, but continuing forward because continuing forward is what events do. Mora had pressed Kleenex into Claire's hand and squeezed her arm. Geraldine had come over and said, without particular fanfare, "Those boys of yours," and shaken her head in the specific way that from Geraldine clearly meant, "I am unexpectedly and significantly moved." Several other women had approached to express admiration for the boys and for Claire herself. Richard Calloway had quietly left before the main program. The 2 men beside him had stayed, but drifted to the opposite end of the room, their earlier conversational ease replaced by something more subdued, more reflective. Thomas had stayed exactly where he was. He was still standing near the coffee station when the boys, diplomatically redirected by Mora toward the dessert table where additional croissants awaited, allowed Claire a moment to breathe. Claire had poured herself a coffee with slightly unsteady hands and was standing near the window, the winter light falling across her face, doing what she had always done after moments of emotional upheaval, gathering herself back into her operational self, the competent one, the one that had work to do. "Your oldest?" said a voice beside her. "He said he's good at being concise." She turned. Thomas was standing a respectful distance away, his coffee cup in his hand, his expression not amused, not pitying, not performing the careful neutrality she had learned to distrust. He looked like someone who had just witnessed something that had rearranged something in him, and was being honest about it. "He's not wrong," Claire said. "Eli is alarmingly concise. It's genetically mysterious. I have never made a short point in my life." A small smile. "I'm Thomas Adler. I worked with Richard, on the Community Development Board." He paused. "I want to say something, and I'm going to attempt to say it correctly, because I think it matters and I don't want to get it wrong. What I said earlier," he stopped. "I didn't say the words Richard said, but I was standing there and I didn't object, and that's the same thing, or close enough to the same thing that I'm not going to pretend there's a meaningful distinction." He looked at her directly. "I'm sorry." Claire studied him. She was, by necessity, a good reader of people. She had become one out of survival. She looked for the performance in his face, the angle, the thing underneath the apology that was really about making himself feel better. She was ready to find it. She didn't find it. "Your boys," Thomas said, and something in his voice changed, softened, took on the quality of someone speaking about something that has genuinely moved them. "Your oldest, what he said about you, about how hard you work, about the midnight computer light." He shook his head slowly. "I have a daughter, she's 10, and I would give anything, genuinely anything, for her to see me the way your sons see you." Claire felt something move in her chest that was not grief and not triumph, but something adjacent to both. "You're clearly doing something extraordinary," Thomas said, "and I spent 30 seconds reducing it to a complication. That says something about me that I'm going to have to think about for a while." "It does," Claire agreed, and she was not unkind about it, only honest. "But the thinking about it part is good. Most people don't get to the thinking part." "Would it be—" He paused, recalibrated. "Is there any chance you'd consider getting a coffee sometime? Not because of this, or not only because of this, because I think you're interesting, and I'd like to have a conversation with you that doesn't start with me needing to apologize." Claire looked at him for a long moment. From across the room, she heard Mason's voice ring out with clarion enthusiasm. "Mom! Mom! There are many quiches!" And then, slightly more quietly, Eli's voice. "Mason, indoors. We've discussed this." And then Noah's barely audible, perfectly timed. "She heard you. The people outside heard you." A real laugh moved through her, unguarded and sudden, and it surprised her, the way real laughs sometimes do when you hadn't had one in a while. She looked back at Thomas Adler and thought about Eli's speech and the gravity-curvature theory of a failing marriage and a backwards bow, and decided that perhaps a calculation done only with small numbers was not really a full calculation after all. "1 coffee," she said, "and I'll have my boys design the vetting questionnaire. Fair warning, Eli's section will require cited sources." Thomas laughed, a genuine laugh, surprised out of him. "That seems entirely fair," he said. It did not look like a grand declaration. It did not look like a scene with swelling music and cinematically timed rainfall. 3 months after the cafe, on a Tuesday night when Claire had a deadline and a migraine and the particular existential exhaustion of someone who has been running at full capacity for 8 years, Thomas came over with dinner. Not restaurant delivery, not organized fanfare, just dinner he had made, in Tupperware containers with a post-it note that said, "For whenever. No pressure, just eat." And he sat with the boys while Claire worked. He helped Eli with an astronomy worksheet. He played the board game Mason had invented, which had by now acquired 17 additional rules. He read quietly in the same room as Noah while Noah drew in his sketchbook. She came downstairs at 9 o'clock to find Mason asleep on the couch, which was structurally impressive given it was not a long couch and Mason was not a compact person. Eli was still at the table, the astronomy worksheet done, now reading. Noah was still drawing. Thomas was washing the Tupperware in her kitchen sink. She stood in the doorway and looked at the scene with the particular quality of attention that belongs to moments you are aware, even as they happen, you will remember forever. "You didn't have to wash those," she said. "I know," he said, and didn't turn around. She stood there a moment longer, watching him in her kitchen, in her slightly messy house where real life happened, with 3 boys existing in the background being their own complicated, magnificent selves, and she thought, this is what I was afraid to want. This exact thing. This ordinary, specific, irreplaceable thing. "I'm falling in love with you," she said. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most true things, directly, without armor. "I'm not requiring anything from you about that. It felt dishonest to not say." Thomas dried his hands on the kitchen towel. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her and looked at her. All of her. The exhaustion and the dignity and the 3 boys behind her and everything that had come before and everything that might come after. "I fell in love with you the moment Eli held up that program booklet," he said, "and I've been catching up to it ever since." From the table, without looking up from his book, "We can hear you." Eli, flat, factual. From the couch, a suspiciously alert quality to Mason's supposed sleep. From the corner, Noah looked up from his sketchbook, looked at his mother, looked at Thomas, and then looked back at his sketchbook and added a small detail to whatever he was drawing, with the air of someone completing a picture they had been working on for some time. Later, after Thomas had gone, after the boys were in bed, after the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Claire went to the kitchen table where Noah had left his sketchbook open. It was their family, the 4 of them, herself, Eli, Mason, Noah, rendered in Noah's careful, expressive lines at the park from that first Sunday. She could recognize each of them immediately. Mason mid-run and already cheating, Eli pointing at the oak tree, herself on the bench. And beside her on the bench, Noah had drawn Thomas. He had drawn him there from the beginning, as though he had always been in the picture and they'd only recently noticed. Below the drawing, in Noah's careful handwriting, sometimes the missing piece wasn't missing. It was just on its way. The sliding door on the minivan still sticks sometimes. Thomas has fixed it twice. It has come unstuck twice. This is either a metaphor or a mechanical issue, and Claire has decided she doesn't need to resolve which. The boys are not. From the very bottom of a full and grateful heart, thank you. Thank you for sitting with this story, for following Claire through the cafe and the brunch and the questionnaire and the park bench and the kitchen at 9 o'clock, for letting Eli's speech land the way it was meant to land, for laughing at Mason because you were always going to laugh at Mason, for noticing Noah, who rarely asks to be noticed and deserves it most. Stories like this one exist because someone out there is living one. Someone is waking up tomorrow and doing the magnificent, unwitnessed, unrewarded, endless, extraordinary work of raising children alone. Someone is walking into a room and feeling the weight of other people's limited imaginations pressing against them. Someone has quietly stopped allowing themselves to want a fuller future because survival has used up every available hour. This story is for them. You know who you are. You are not less for having more on your plate. You are not diminished by your history. You are not a problem requiring management. You are a person in a story that is still being written.